Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes, and welcome to Books My Dad, who has a PhD in English Literature, thinks I should read because reading them improves my understanding of good literature. Also known as Gwen aimlessly chatters about real literature. So today's book, I'm putting this in a little earlier in my lineup than I might have because I'm waiting on a Cat Who book to come in from the library, so there you go. But this particular book on my father's list of books is actually book one of a trilogy. According to him, the third book is most frequently talked about in isolation, but it is part of a trilogy, and he feels that each book sort of connects to and feeds off the others, such that they should really all be read as a trilogy, so all three of them are on his list. This is a book that I didn't find light and fun. However, the back of this book, its ostensible dust jacket, which it doesn't actually have a dust jacket or flyleaf because this is a trade paperback, but this claims that this is richly humorous and that there's happy, healthy laughter in it. I didn't find any, but that could be because of some sort of a cultural gap between 1941, when this was initially published, or because I just don't have a sense of humor that really functions well with understanding these books. So the book itself is Herself Surprised by Joyce Cary. As I said, this is book one of a trilogy, and the other two books in the trilogy are to follow. So this is a book about a woman who is from the English lower classes, who was in service, as they once said, working as a cook at the time, and the master of the house, who is at least according to our protagonist, Sally, somewhat put upon by his mother and sisters. He, for some reason that she's never quite sure of, falls in love with her and proposes to her, and much of the first section of this book is filled with her talking about how she never quite understood it, and a great deal of this book is actually made up of her expressing that she never quite understands what they see in her. She's not of the appropriate class when her husband, Matthew, when he asks her to marry him, she's not of the appropriate class, she doesn't have the appropriate education, and she makes a fool of herself a lot and knows that she's making a fool of herself a lot. And the most central theme in this book, it starts right at the outset and continues through, and that's her saying, I knew better at the time, I should have known better at the time, and yet I did it anyways. And that's kind of the whole of this book. I should have known better, but I did it anyhow. And Herself Surprised, very, very specifically, relates to the fact that she surprises herself over and over again. She never quite knows why she did what she did. And it's something that brings to mind a particular scientific theory that I don't know if it's still going around, and I don't know if it's a genuine theory or a genuine hypothesis. As we all know, there is a distinction between the two. But I don't know whether it's a going theory or not. But I'd heard it in passing that the human mind works in a very strange way, according to this theory, that we don't in fact make decisions based on conscious thought, that we all make our decisions and then justify them afterwards to an extent. And with her, there's a great sense that she makes these decisions, and she stands by her decisions. Once she has chosen a course, she doesn't tend to deviate from that course, because she believes that if you make a choice, then you've made your bed and you must lie in it. But it's just repeated over and over again that she just doesn't know why. She doesn't know why Matt asks her to marry him, and she doesn't know why she said yes. At the very start of the book, she says that she said yes without even thinking about it. It just sort of came out, and the next thing she knew, she was getting married. And after several years of a fairly happy marriage, her husband is talked into allowing an artist to live with them to work on a particular painting in their home, and she winds up not having an affair with him, but her husband becomes convinced that she did. And when he's dying, because he is many, many years older than her, that she's, I believe, 20 when they get married, and he's already 40. But he's dying years later, and the artist comes back and he tries to talk her into agreeing to marry him when her husband dies. She refuses, but after her husband dies, the artist, Gully Jimson, comes back and asks her again. And she agrees, and she never quite knows why. She just does. She knows that he abused his last wife. Indeed, she found it quite horrifying that his last wife, Nina, kept on coming around covered in bruises, but she agrees anyhow. And she doesn't know why, she just does. And when it turns out that he's still legally married to a third woman who he never sees, and that Nina had just been pretending to be his wife, and because no one ever asked, that it just didn't come up, and he proposes, well, you can just pretend to be my wife. I don't ever see my wife. And she says, well, why don't you divorce her then if you never see her? And he says, oh, it's too much trouble. And she agrees to go with him, even knowing the sort of man he is, even knowing all of these things about him, she still agrees. And says in this book that she doesn't know why. Part of this is that she seems very attracted to people who are able to accept their lot in life and make the best of it. She does seem to place very great store by making the best of things, by accepting that the world is a particular way and that complaining about it won't help. And so she sets great store by people who seem to find ways to be happy despite how awful something around them may be. And so she goes for several years as Gully Jimson's not wife, but everyone thinks she is, until that falls apart, and she winds up taking up service again, finally, and winds up in a relationship with a third man who is a gentleman and a lawyer and I think a solicitor rather than a barrister, for those to whom it would make a difference. He doesn't seem to be an in-court lawyer. He seems to have been a lawyer more concerned with the writings of contracts. And personality-wise, he seems very unlikely to have been the sort to do barrister work. But she winds up in this strange relationship with him where he doesn't want to get married, but he is in love with her, and she cares about him deeply, but again, she doesn't quite know why, and she feels she's the wrong class because, once again, she's in service. She's not educated. She's not upper class. She still tends... She lived in the upper classes for years and had 3 children who were raised in the upper classes, and she still had a tendency to drop into the broad tones of the rural part of England that she's from. And she feels these gaps, these lacks, very, very sharply. And with her last employer, with her last, the last man that she works for, I believe it was Mr. Wiltshire, and she lives with him for years, and because she's afraid of Jimson by this point, she knows that Jimson tends to be vicious, knows that he could come lunging out of nowhere and ruin her reputation and all sorts of things. She continues to support Jimson at a distance. And she does this by robbing Mr. Wiltshire, by robbing her employer. And he trusts her, and he cares about her deeply, and he puts her in charge of his household, and all of these things. And she continues to steal from him, and says repeatedly throughout the book that she had savings, and she wasn't using them, the only reason why being that she had promised herself she never would, and yet she continued to rob this man even though she had the money to send to Jimson herself. And at the end of the book, the most telling thing is that she's sent to prison for 18 months, and all of her, and Mr. Wiltshire has turned on her and has said that he will not keep her anymore, which is understandable. She had been stealing from him for a very long time. Although her friends kept on saying that there were things she should have said, explanations she should have given, which she refuses to give because she feels that she has stolen. And thus, she has made her bed and must lie in it, and there are no excuses. It's a very simple view of the world. It's uncomplicated. And at the end of the book, the last sentence of the book, it's a fairly long sentence, is that a good cook will always find work even without a character, and can get a new character in 12 months and better herself, which, God helping me, I shall do, and keep a more watchful eye next time on my flesh, now I know it better. That she knows over the years she has done these wrong things, and that her whole life has been the 50 years, because she's in her 50s at the end of this book, the 50 odd years that she's been alive, she has surprised herself surprised, as the title says, over and over again, as she learned who she was, and that she's still learning who she is, and that at this stage, at the end of this book, she is saying she will do better now, God willing, now that she knows better who she is and how to watch herself for the things that she does wrong. That her view of herself is almost that she does these things inexplicably. She doesn't know why she does them, she just does them. And she puts it down to a weakness of flesh, not the devil, which, is all very well and good. But there's a strange push and pull of not self-knowledge and a lack of self-knowledge. Because on the one hand, it's all about her learning who she is as a person as she goes and figuring this out. But there's very little self-examination, that this is all a self-examination that happens decades later. It's a self-examination that has her regretting how she treated her friend Roxy. It has her regretting years later how she treated all these people. But regretting it with an understanding due to hindsight, not something that she learned as she went. And it's not about the learning process as she goes, it's about a learning process that was abruptly thrust upon her and at the end of this book. And it's a very strange book in that way. And I'm not sure I have anything else to say, so I'll see you all next week.